Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 18th IIOA webinar. It's Jing Meng. I will lead the newsletter and also the webinar this year. Today we are very pleased to have Dr. Karsten Mau to give a talk about the about inferring input-output linkage with firm-level trade data. Dr. Karsten Mau is an associate professor of economics at Maastricht University School of Business and Economics. He teaches and researches on topics in international trade and also economic development. Karsten is also director of emerging markets, specializing track of SBE's economics and international business BSc program. His research has focused broadly on three areas, including China's exports and their role in global economy, and also place-based policies and regional economic development, as well as trade in cross-border supply chains. His work has been published in many high-profile peer-reviewed journals, including the Review of Economic Studies and the Journal of Development Economics. Today, the topic is inferring input-output linkage with firm-level trade data, and the talk will be recorded. The floor is yours, Karsten.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much, Jing, for this nice introduction and also for making this seminar possible, giving me the opportunity to present. I assume that I'm not very well known among many of you because the input-output analysis is not really the core field of my activities, but as you could perhaps sense from the introduction, my focus on cross-border supply chain linkages kind of triggered my interest also in this into this area. I think the motivation also for this talk and for this paper comes a bit from that work, and namely the fact that when we want to analyze the impact of trade policies or the transmission of shocks across borders, we kind of want to know, of course, what these input-output linkages are. So let me start right away with the introduction, and then of course if you have questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt. So in principle, I think the main problem that we are facing as trade economists or empirical economists is that whenever we would like to analyze the propagation of shocks along the supply chain, we are typically missing detail in our data because we know that, of course, there are input-output tables for many countries and regions and years nowadays, but often what is missing for this more granular analysis where trade policy or other shocks are taking place, we simply lack the possibility to distinguish affected from non-affected products. And I think this came very much to the surface also during the first US-China trade war and also later during the COVID pandemic when people tried to study this topic with trade data. So the main aim of this paper or of this project is to try to find a way to obtain more detailed information on these product level input-output linkages. So what we are doing very briefly is to develop like a systematic approach that allows us to infer input-output linkages from particular types of data sets. And those are, in our current applications, firm-level customs data that give us information about the firms, what they export and import. And then to apply this so-called ARM, association rule mining technique, to recognize systematic patterns in the imports and export transactions so that we can infer from these recurring patterns a sort of a systematic link between the imports, which we consider as inputs, and the exports, which we consider as output. And that basically gives us a bit of a probabilistic measure or indicator of an input-output linkage. So it's based on inference, not on observation. So it of course comes with some inaccuracies, but we are trying to fine-tune our approach to apply to different kinds of data sets, and then also, of course, to compare to other data sets that have been used or developed recently in the literature. What we also do in this paper, and I will show you hopefully at the end of the talk, are some applications. So we try to validate our approach to see whether with our mapping we are able to predict imports in the trade data based on the export dynamics that we observe for the same country, so that we can basically prove or find some supportive evidence for the existence of these input-output linkages in international trade. So I will tell you a bit more about it later in the talk. All right, so maybe very quick also a summary of the main findings is that in principle these input-output networks are bipartite networks. So there is a set of inputs and a set of outputs always, and there are linkages between them. And of course, the more granular we go with our data, the more sparse they become, which becomes also at some point a problem for identification. But of course, when we aggregate it more, and we aggregate it, for instance, to similar levels as wired input-output database data, then we also see some familiar patterns, such as like this very prominent diagonal where we see a lot of intra-industry transactions. This we can also replicate with our data when we aggregate it. And then maybe, I'm not sure if you have heard about this approach. There has been an AI-generated production network by Timo Fetzer and a couple of colleagues who also generate these very disaggregated binary input-output network. So we compare our mappings to their mapping, and we find some significant overlaps, but also some quite striking differences between our and their mappings. So this is still part of our exploration, and so we have not finalized our work yet. It's not really close to submission yet. It's still work in progress, but there are a couple of things I would like to present to you, and maybe you also have some comments on this. So when it comes to the external validation, as I said, we wanted to try to see whether we can actually find some explanatory power if we see export growth as an explanatory variable, whether we see then also higher import in the goods that we find are upstream to those exports. And we do find quite some encouraging results here for China, which is also our training sample, where our training sample is coming from. So we find quite strong external validation for this, but then also for a few other countries in Southeast Asia. And then in our applications, we find, for example, that during the WTO entry of China in the early 2000s, we can also document that the export growth in particular products entailed indeed also growing imports of the upstream inputs that we identified. And actually also that countries who have a strong comparative advantage in providing those inputs systematically started to export more to China because of this. So there has been really a clear link between China's export growth on the output side at a very disaggregated granular level and the pattern of imports, how it has changed in response to this. And then we find something similar also more recently for the US-China trade war episode, not the current one, but the one that was during the first Trump administration in 2018 and 19, where we also find some pass-through, basically, that third countries were affected by this through these input-output linkages. So that's in a nutshell what we are doing and finding. So very quick again, regarding the motivation in the literature, we find a number of papers that are trying to trace out indeed this supply chain transmission of policy shocks. And for this, of course, they rely a lot on input-output tables. For the United States and the US-China trade war context, people rely a lot on the BEA input-output tables, which is quite granular. Then for international settings, it's more challenging, as I said already, because usually the level of aggregation is much higher. But then there have also been some other approaches to try to work with firm level or product level data, but it's very challenging always to come up with a convincing strategy. And this is, I think, where we are trying to make a contribution here, to find a way to more reliably and systematically infer those linkages, so that we can also really allow for broader applications in the empirical analysis of policy shocks. We are building already on a very active and emerging and also very dynamic literature, increasingly dynamic literature, where scholars try to infer input-output linkages or production networks. I think the first paper in the second list of bullet points by Hilke is something that is sort of similar to ours. They use single product firms in India, and they can observe which products those or which materials those single product firms are buying, and from this they get basically an end-to-one mapping of the purchased inputs to the output product of the firm. So they really restrict themselves to single product firms to avoid mismeasurement or inaccuracies that would be entailed by multi-product firms. We go indeed this step to go to multi-product firms because we find that multi-product firms are much more often and frequently observed, and we don't want to discard this information that these multi-product firms carry, and instead we try to find a more sophisticated method of linking those input purchases to the produced outputs that we see in their respective baskets. And thereby, I think we go very closely to the bottom of these bullet points here, where authors like Carbeska Hidalgo, they try to develop a very simple algorithmic approach, but also O'Clery at the bottom is very similar to ours, to really systematically exploit this data to recognize those patterns and then describe them. And so what our contribution is indeed to kind of develop this mechanism further, and also to link it a bit closer to economic intuition and concepts that are maybe important to know when we work with this data and these kind of methods, and eventually also to bring it to applications, which is not done in this literature here that I'm citing at the bottom. Yes, and then there are, of course, some conceptual challenges. I think I'm not going to elaborate too much on those in this paper, but that's, of course, also something more generally to take into account when it comes to network inference. Okay, so I think I will try to briefly explain, the background of to kind of define the problem and then see how we can tackle it. So I think the problem that we are facing is indeed the one that is described here in this very general equation. There is a firm that produces an output product I, and it uses a bunch of different inputs next to also other factors like labor and capital. But this capital X is a vector of different inputs that are used to produce the output. And what we don't typically observe or know as economists is what are indeed those these axes that are used to produce the output good. So it's actually pretty difficult to answer this question because usually we cannot observe it. So it's hard to look inside the firms. And then, of course, we know that most firms indeed are multi-product firms, so it's very rare to observe it. So basically what we use when we are trying to look into a firm with a common data set that we would get at customs offices or maybe also in other administrative data sets would be basically a firm that looks like this box here on the left. There are 3 output products, and then there are a bunch of inputs that those firms are purchasing. Think of now exports on the left and imports on the right. And then there are probably these connecting lines. I mean, we assume that there's a reason why firms buy this list of products if they export this list of other products, but we don't observe those lines. And that's indeed the core challenge that we are trying to tackle, to find a way to effectively infer those edges. Then, of course, when we are thinking about a bit more deeply about what we know about firms and international trade in particular, since we are going to use firm level trade data, we also have to take into account that there is different degrees of vertical integration. So some firms buy products to produce an intermediate good and then make the final product out of it. And firms may choose different degrees of vertical integration. So that means that if we observe several firms that sell Y1, Y2, and Y3, they might have different input purchases because they have different degrees of vertical integration. So we don't really also observe an intermediate production step. This is something that we cannot fix in our current approach. We are assuming basically whenever we observe firms' imports and export baskets, that these are directly linked to each other and that there is no no extreme heterogeneity, so to say, across firms in terms of their vertical integration, so that they can actually be directly linked. Then there's this CAT that's called a carry-along trade. That's something that has been documented in the trade literature and the firm-level trade literature for a couple of years already. We know that whenever we observe international trade data of firms, that sometimes firms export products that they did not produce. So it could be then basically that we see some Ys on the left side of this graph that we wrongly connect to inputs because they are in the export basket, but they are actually not produced with those inputs, but they are maybe commissioned through some other intermediary or another firm. And that is, of course, also a thread of identification with our method that we can try to get a hands on, but it depends very much, I think, also on the kind of data that is going to be used to control this issue, right? So our approach to take care of this trade intermediary or indirect exporting and carry along trade is something I will explain together with the data set. Then it becomes, I think, a bit more clear. But in principle, the idea that we're taking here is that we know that customs data, for example, firm level customs data and customs data in general is collected very systematically according to internationally harmonized standards, which means that firm level customs data set looks more or less the same in different countries. There's usually a firm, a product that they buy or sell, and then also the value or maybe the trade partner. And the trick is basically to get data sets or a large number of observations of similar firms that export similar goods so that we can also look systematically at their import baskets. So the larger, of course, the sample, the more certainty we can ascribe to these co-occurring patterns. And then, of course, we want to also make sure that the degree of product diversification, so the number of products a firm exports, is not too excessive, so that we can still reasonably conclude from the co-occurring patterns that there's actually a link between two particular items and that the multi-product character of the firms is not leading to too high levels of inaccuracy and mismeasurement. All right. This is the idea, and then the method is basically derived from the so-called association rule mining approach. So it's a sort of a like very, very early stage machine learning algorithm, and I think once we understand how it works, it seems like too big of a term to call it machine learning. It's basically systematic counting and then converting into fractions. But basically, it's just a systematic counting approach. So there are basically two parameters that we're interested in, and that means we are observing a bunch of firms. So the number of firms that we have in our sample is denoted by n, right? So n is the total number of firms in our sample. And then we have the number nk, where k indicates a particular observation of interest, which could be, for instance, the firm that exports product k. And then we simply calculate the fraction of this, and in the ARM terminology, they call it the support. So that's basically just a fraction, basically, of firms that do something that we are interested in. Then our main measure of interest eventually kind of comes from finding a way to infer like non-random or more than random co-occurrences. And here we use, instead of this K, we now use the co-occurrence of an imported good and an exported good. So let's say that for instance, a washing machine exporter imports aluminum parts. So this would then be basically the fraction of firms that simultaneously export washing machines and import aluminum parts are expressed here in the numerator of this lower fraction. And then the lower, the product at the bottom and the denominator is basically the support of that gives us the general probability to observe washing machine exports or aluminum parts imports. So the product of those general frequencies of the products in our data set is then used as a weight. And then by construction, we obtain an indicator L that can be larger or smaller than 1. But as soon as it becomes larger than 1, we can conclude that this is a more than random co-occurrence. So this looks, I think, very intuitive. This ARM has been used in various applications. It's not very commonly used, I think, in economics, as far as I know, but for instance, in marketing sciences or in, I think, also medical sciences in different disciplines, it has been applied to recognize patterns. I think that in the context of using firm-level trade data, there are a couple of things to take into consideration, and I think the main drawbacks are twofold. I mean, one drawback might be that this magnitude of this lift ratio here, this L, is a bit difficult to interpret, right? So that's something that is a bit tricky, and then that requires some more thinking how to use those measures really. I think we cannot directly infer some input or output coefficients from this because it's really a different measure here. But then the other issue is that traditionally, or if you're familiar with trade data or firm level trade data even, you will see that the networks are super sparse, which means that oftentimes we have very, very small fractions here. And then as soon as we multiply two very, very small fractions with each other, it becomes an even smaller term. And if this one is in the denominator, it will dramatically inflate this index overall. So we have illustrated this at some point in our research. We don't illustrate it anymore, but there's basically this restriction that this denominator is very likely to inflate the overall measure, so that oftentimes we got very high numbers of larger than 1 values that might be simply due to the sparsity of the network itself, and then is not the best applicable tool perhaps. So that's something to keep in mind. So what we do instead is basically we use this IRM and try to bring it to integrate it into something, let's say a bit more gradual, a so-called backward-forward algorithm. So this is the idea that has been developed by Karbevska and Hidalgo in a slightly different context, where we basically not take the entirety of our data set as the baseline, but we always go basically product by product to calculate those ratios. So we basically first go backward. So we look first at all the firms that produce or export output I, so all the washing machine producers, so to say. And then we look at their import basket. What are those washing machine exporters importing? And we see a firm that has 2 import products, and one has 4 and the other has also 4. And then we see the darkly shaded ones are basically 2 of the same kind. So here we see that 2 out of 3 firms that sell washing machines abroad are buying this input that we have here highlighted in dark red. So this gives us basically a ratio or a score of 2/3 for this particular input candidate J for output I. The problem with this approach is once again the multi-product firms. So we know not whether this washing machine exporter also exports dryers or other equipment that is useful for laundry. So that might be that we are wrongly assigning some input candidates to washing machines, although it actually belongs to the other good that this firm produces, right? And to fix this, we are trying to use also the forward method to use the inputs to see, okay, which firms are that are importing aluminum parts are exporting washing machines. And then we see, let's say, in this example, that 3 out of 4 firms do that. So we get also a pretty high input score and a very specific matching between aluminum parts and washing machine, although probably in reality, aluminum parts are used also in many other applications. But in principle, we get these two scores, which are not necessarily inflated, and then we are combining the two to obtain an overall score that gives us sort of a weighted probability that J is an input for product I. Right, so this is basically our approach. So a very simple counting and weighting routine, which gives us eventually a mapping between every potential combination of products that firms import and export, and we can use a classification that is internationally harmonized, such as the harmonized system that is used in customs offices, and thereby we can try to obtain a one-to-one matching for all the different product combinations. So let's see what kind of data we have been using so far and whether this is a good data set or not. Our training data set is basically a cross-section of firms that have been trading in 2004 that we obtained from the China Customs database. It's a data set that has been used widely in the economic literature, not so much input-output analysis, but more generally to discuss and analyze China's impact on the global economy and export growth. And we are using this sample because we think that in 2004, China was really expanding. So it was already trading quite a lot. There is a lot of coverage in terms of products, but also in terms of the number of observations that we have for each product. We also assume that in 2004, China was still in a stage, at least more so than maybe today, where it relied a lot on imported intermediate inputs. So basically, we assume that there was a pretty high degree of cross-border supply chains in action, so that actually, whenever we see exports of some goods by Chinese firms, there should also be some corresponding imports. So that's indeed something that gives us basically justification to using this data set. And then in order to make sure that we are not just observing warehouse or re-exports or this carry-along trade, we can also look at the customs regime, which is reported in the data set. And in particular, we can explicitly exclude warehouses trade or re-exports trade from our samples, so that at least to some extent we can get rid of these carry-along trade or trade intermediaries, which would lead us, run the risk or expose us to the risk of inferring false positives here. Eventually, what we are doing in the final sample selection, you can see in the raw data, there are more than 3 million observations. We are kind of compressing and aggregating the data set to reduce sparsity, but also to make it a bit more handleable, the data overall. So we have aggregated our data set eventually to the 4-digit level. And for some illustration purposes, we also went to the 2-digit level. So the 4-digit level has about, you can see it here, 1,300 different product categories, and the 2-digit chapters have 96 different categories. And then, of course, we can only focus on firms that do both importing and exporting. It's not very useful to look at firms that do only one of the two. So this, of course, leads also to quite some, quite a reduction in the sample size. But still, in 2004, we have close to 67,000 firms that simultaneously imported and exported at least one product in these respective categories. So this is, I think, a very nice sample to work with. Let me show you some summary statistics very briefly. So we can see in this one here, for instance, in panel A, we can see, for example, how many products are typically exported or imported by a firm, right? So on average, a firm exports about 10 or 11 products and imports 14 to 15 goods. We see, if we go through the distribution, that 75% of the firms in this sample export at most 7 goods, which means it's not extremely diversified. But of course, when we go to the extreme, it goes to more than 500 products. And on the import side, we see that 75% of the firms import 17 inputs or products or less. And that gives us a bit of confidence that we have not too much of a very complicated spaghetti bowl in the majority of our sample, and that there's indeed a reasonable number of firms with only a few products that they export and import, so that the link detection should work based on this. The other way around, we also see that some products are imported or exported only by very few firms, whereas some products are imported and exported by almost every firm. And the median numbers tell us basically that we have, for each product where we look for the input and output candidates respectively, we see between 100 and 200 observations, which gives us also a bit of confidence regarding the number of observations that we can exploit in our analysis. All right. Then what is this? Yeah, this is a bit more on the sectoral composition. Maybe this is not so relevant now. I go back to proceed with the data description. So this China customs database is basically what you're going to see most for most of the remainder of this paper, of this talk. What we are currently doing, but it's still very much in progress, so I cannot show you much, is to use also data sets from other countries to explore a little bit how does the pattern or input-output linkages we infer now for China 2004, how does it look in other countries, or how does it change over time within a country. I can tell you a little bit about it, but not so much, unfortunately, because it takes a bit of time to get all this running. But maybe indeed. So what I can show you first is a bit the cross-country stuff that we are getting at Panjiva. So these are all 2-digit linkages. So for illustration purposes, it works pretty well. This is Bolivia. So Bolivia, it's a small economy, landlocked. It's not very diversified, not very many firms, and we get basically an input-output table that looks like this one here. At the 2-digit level, where the columns are the exported product categories and the rows are the imported product categories. And then if we do this for several countries in our sample for 2007, that is, I think, the year when most countries had data available, we see also again here a strong diagonal, which looks familiar. China is a bit more fine-grained. There are more observations here than in Chile and Bolivia, so it's a bit more, there's a bit more gradients in between the scores. We see some dark patches that are reoccurring a little bit. Colombia is again very scattered. So it seems that the number of firms that we get in our sample, but also the overall level of diversification of an economy matters. India again looks also maybe slightly similar to China. And we can go on to show a couple of countries with more or less strong patterns, but also some reoccurrent patterns that we see across those countries. So you can see now that mainly the countries that I'm showing you are Latin American middle-income countries, and then we have a few Asian economies, China, India, and Vietnam. So these are probably the economies we are going to focus on the most later in our paper. Mainly because many of the Latin American economies are very raw material oriented. There's not a lot of manufacturing base, and that makes it probably very difficult to infer meaningful patterns, with the exception maybe of Mexico, which clearly has this link towards the US economy and a lot of manufacturing activity in their country. But this is basically what we have at the moment in terms of the cross-sectional correlations at the 2-digit level. Ideally, we are going to expand it also to 4 digits and also try to see how it evolves over time. What I can tell you maybe anecdotally from some checks has been that for China, we have also a 4-digit mapping, and we look at it for 2013, and then every year until 2023, and we see a positive correlation between the mappings over time. But of course, it goes down to maybe, I don't know, 70% or 60% in terms of the correlation between the 2013 and the 2023 version of this data. So there's certainly a change in the pattern over time, but we have not yet systematically explored or analyzed them. Okay, so now let's go back to the main data set. So it's again China 2004, and this is how the import-export association matrix looks like at the 4-digit level. You can see, of course, it's much sparser. There's a lot of white and a few dark spots that are, I think, in similar positions as before. And these are then the ones, the darker spots are the ones where we are now suspecting to be input-output relationships. We can aggregate the 4-digit categories to the classification, the ISIC4 category that is used in WIAT to some extent, of course, because not all of them, I think, are easily combinable. But in the end, we have basically manufacturing input-output coefficients from WIAT. If we put them on a log scale and take the average score from this matrix on the left, on the horizontal axis, we see a pretty good, maybe much better than expected positive correlation, given that the matrix on the left is inferred only based on trade transactions in a cross-section of firm, whereas the WIAT data has a clearly different original source and partly relies on observational or officially reported data on input-output linkages. So this gives us a bit of confidence that the mapping actually is also in line and kind of sensible that we obtain. We see, of course, that the correlation sometimes differs across particular industries, certainly because we know that in international trade, it's not an entire representation of the domestic industry structure, but only basically the most competitive industry structure, whereas a lot of activity also takes place mainly domestically. That's why I think we see some differences in the accuracy between the correlation that we see in our matrix and what would be reported in terms of input coefficient for different sectors. But we also don't find a very systematic correlation between, let's say, the revealed comparative advantage or, some patterns that describe industry specialization in the country. So it's not clear why in some sectors the correlation is better than in others. What is also interesting is maybe to compare our mapping to one that has recently been promoted quite a lot in various places, and also starts to being used in academic research, the AIPNet, so the AI generated production network. We are comparing it with them, with the tricky part, of course, that they have a binary network and we have scores. So basically what we are trying to do, we are comparing our scores mainly to the binary scores by estimating in a probit model, for example, but also by saying, okay, we only use the strongest linkages in our metrics, and these would be basically where the score is at least 2 times higher than the average score for the same output and input combination, right? So we take the averages of each row and column to see whether the score is clearly above that, and then we consider those strong linkages. And if we use those and try to predict the linkages that Fetzer et al. Have found in the IPNet, we find some positive correlation there, but it's not perfect. So let's see if we have that here. We see some similar distributional properties. So the BFA, this is our approach in pink. And then the blue one is the AIPNet one. So there are some similarities, but also some differences in terms of product complexity or input ubiquity. We get similar levels of sparsity in the network, but it's certainly not the same that we are obtaining with our method compared to what they obtain with their approach. So let's see maybe also some concrete example. So for instance, when we look at aluminum, what this AIPNet mapping obtains as inputs for unwrought aluminum are those that you can see here in the circled green and yellow areas. So these are basically the green ones are the ones that are strong linkages to according to our method, but also according to their method, which are waste scrap of aluminum, aluminum oxide, converters, ladles, ingot molds, and casting machines, clearly, and then also ores and concentrates. So these are very plausible inputs for unwrought aluminum. But then what they find also are those here at the bottom. So we see also industrial sewing machines, air conditioning machines, or other mainly equipment, it seems. This is stuff that we don't find to be strong linkages in our data. But they are maybe, yeah, they do have a positive score, but they don't seem to appear systematically in our data. However, we find some others that they don't find. So you can see that there is an overlap, but it's not complete. And I think neither of the two is getting to perfection. So these are then the different parts or areas where we still have to do some work to disentangle and to understand the reasons why we find some linkages that might not be very, very obvious why there is an input, why these are labeled as inputs. Yes, but this is more or less the way how we are currently comparing our results to that of others. Yes. Okay, so I think maybe just to check very quickly that it's, I think, total 1 hour for presentation, so I have about 15 minutes left. Let me use the remaining time to talk a little bit about the applications that we have. So basically what we want to know now with our very granular mapping is whether we can actually use it also for supply chain analysis or cross-border supply chain analysis. And the first thing we are doing is we use our mapping that we obtained from this 2004 cross-section to see whether we can predict import growth rates at the product level by observing downstream export growth rates at the product level. So growth rates clearly are not a cross-section of a single year, but it's basically the growth rate or the average annual growth rate for a period of years. And I mean, these are, I think, usually very, very noisy because we know that in export and import of products, there's a lot of volatility from year to year. So we take the average annual growth rate of products at the 4-digit level for China over a period of 5 years. We calculate the average annual growth rate for that period. And we estimate in a simple regression whether this average annual import growth rate of product J can be predicted by the average annual growth rate, of the weighted average of the average growth rates of all the downstream exports products that we have matched to the input, right? So basically we have a weighted average of export growth rate that differs across inputs J based on the score that we have identified beforehand. So here is basically formally how we are calculating this. It's a very weighted average. And the idea is whether we can see if import growth in downstream products responds to export growth upstream. And to handle a little bit the noise in the data, we remove outliers by kicking out the top and bottom 1% of those measures because it's really going in all directions. We have annual growth rates sometimes of several thousands %, and that's because they're sometimes really jumping from very small to very large and back to very small values, which of course we don't want to see. So what we get in this external validation exercise is this set of the results. What I highlight in blue is basically our main and preferred mapping. The same mapping at 2-digit levels according to our backward-forward ARM method is in column 1. And we compare this also to IPNet mappings just to see whether our results are exceptional or not. So what seems to be the case here in this table is that they're not necessarily exceptional. We do see positive and significant correlations in all 4 columns, regardless of the level of aggregation. When we look at the R-squared, so if you want to attribute some meaning to the R-squared, you could argue that our backward-forward algorithm has a slightly better fit than IPNet. which can be also due to the reason that we capture different goods that are not necessarily inputs, but they are part of production processes or of economies of scope of the firms and so on. And that's why naturally they would show up in the trade data, although they're not necessarily, strictly speaking, inputs. So it seems that our method captures also slightly something different to what AIPNet does. But when it comes to analyzing trade flows and the interdependence between imported inputs and exported outputs, we see a slightly stronger and better fit in our case. We then also did some robustness checks to kind of see whether this is a random result, right? That maybe the mapping that we obtain is random and it just happens to be a good fit. And the same could be the case for AIPNet. So we basically, now in robustness checks, we are randomizing the mapping at the 4-digit level and re-estimate it. So we give 1,000 different kinds of random linkages and 1,000 times re-estimate this specification from column 2 and report the different coefficients that we obtain. The original coefficient is this 1.21. Which is the red dash line, the vertical one here, and the bars show the distribution, which is centered around 0. And from this, we conclude that our mapping is not randomly producing a positive coefficient, because that would normally look differently. So we are confident here that our mapping is not just a random outcome. Then we want to see to what extent the mapping that we obtain for China also holds in other countries. Of course, we know input coefficients differ across countries, sometimes significantly so. But on the other hand, when we look really just at the intermediate inputs or the particular materials that are sometimes used for particular products, there might be quite some overlaps and similarities, especially if we think of similar economies that are similarly also integrated in global supply chains. And what we find here for a set, this is now a panel estimation for a set of 11 different Southeast Asian economies. The external validation is much weaker. We find it again only for the 4-digit level in our backward-forward approach. But upon closer inspection, we see that this result, this positive correlation, mainly is resulting from just a few of those 11 countries, whereas another set of those countries is not really following this mapping. So if we run it country by country, we see here the more darkly colored areas or countries, which are Vietnam, namely, and Thailand. And Singapore, you cannot see it, but it also has very strong positive correlation. So it seems to be technologically, but also in terms of supply chain integration, quite similar to China. So all of these 4 specifications are positive and significant for Thailand and Vietnam. And then there's a bunch of other countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, but also Timor-Leste, Philippines, and so on, where it is less frequently working. So there it seems to be a bit more fragile. And then some countries like Myanmar, Cambodia, or Laos, for them it actually never works. So it seems to some extent what we conclude at the moment that depends, of course, on the overall degree of industrialization of the countries, that these mappings can also be used for external settings, that there's some external validity for them, but also it seems to depend on the degree to which countries are really integrated in cross-border supply chains. All right, so this is so much for the external validation at this stage, and then I would like to show you 2 applications to see how we are, or to show you how we are intending to use also this mapping in a more concrete case. And so far we are looking at 2 cases. So the first one is China's WTO entry in 2001. So it's sort of a historical event, but the advantage is that it has been widely studied, so it's well understood. We don't have to introduce the case very much at length, and we can simply say in this first figure that around 2001, so around that period, so a few years before and after, we do see that China has decreased its tariff, which you can see by the downward sloping row of bars. So China has decreased its tariffs, meaning that likely imports are going to increase. At the same time, we see that compared to the pre-WTO years, there has been quite a massive expansion in both exports and imports. So if you just look at the slope of those orange and blue curves, you see that the slope clearly becomes steeper in the post-2001 period. And that is basically this expansion or this China shock that a lot of people have written about, mainly focusing on Chinese exports to study the impact of those exports on other countries in terms of Chinese competition and so on. So our story is basically going the other way. We say that, okay, there has been export growth, that's quite evident, but there has also been import growth. And probably much of these imports are actually inputs for those exports. So what we're now going to do, we are going to partition the sample into two groups. We see a group of products that has experienced a very high increase in the export growth rates. So comparing the pre and the post 2001 periods, we say these are the high growth exports. And we check which are the inputs that are most likely linked to those exports. And then we do it also for the low growth or the comparatively low growth exports. And we see what are the predominantly used and inferred inputs for those. So when we do this, we can do a simple diff and diff graph here. We see that the inputs that are associated to the fastest growing exports are actually picking up systematically after 2001, which you can see by the blue line and the, the purple confidence interval. Whereas the group that is associated, the imports that are associated to the slower growing exports are also increasing, but much less so. And it's also a bit more all over the place, right? So when we actually take this to an econometric analysis, we can see that, for instance, a 10% increase in the growth rate of exports is associated with a 3 to 4% increase in the import of the associated inputs. And this has, of course, some implications, because there are then countries that benefit from China's export growth by providing these inputs. And these are typically the countries that have a strong comparative advantage in those products. And if we look at them, we can see, for example, that I hope that the colors are visible for you, that the green colored areas are the countries that typically have a strong comparative advantage in the products for which China created massive import demand or input demand to build its exports. And the darker colored, the more, orange or brown colored areas are the ones that are not very much exposed to China's demand shock following its export growth. So this is, I think, one of the findings that we can nicely show here. And also econometrically, we can show that. I think I will skip it now to very quickly go also to the other application. Here we are looking at the US-China trade war, where we can see that there has been a bunch of products that were facing dramatic increases in US tariffs on Chinese goods. So it was very much harder now for China to sell those products to the US. And this escalated, and basically it escalated and became most visible in 2019, where you can see that the blue bars are clearly turning negative compared to the previous trend. And the gray ones are the ones that were not tariffed or not exposed to tariff. So again, we can do basically this diff and diff analysis. Unfortunately, I don't have monthly data for China's exports at that time, because I think China Customs stopped releasing those monthly figures. We only have annual data, but we can also see that here the import of inputs that were related to the goods where the US increased the tariffs on Chinese products have decreased systematically more than the inputs that were not associated to those tariff products. And that is basically what we see here. We see red and blue. There's no clear distinction early. Then there is sometimes slower growth or higher growth in the pre-trade war period. But then clearly in 2019, we see this drop of the red bar, which clearly shows basically this tariff this backward or upstream propagation of the U.S. tariff shock on Chinese imports. Quantitatively, this effect is less prominent than what I showed you before with the WTO entry, partly maybe because there might be more diversification or other reasons, or maybe also the mapping is not so up to date anymore. It's still based in 2004, but also we know, of course, that China is not only exporting to the US. About 10 to 12% of its exports go to the US in that period. So accordingly, this coefficient should factor in, of course, that the US is not always China's main export market. So maybe China was able to divert part of its exports so that the corresponding import demand is also not so strongly affected in quantitative terms as we could see it before. So these are the two applications we have at the moment. Maybe just to summarize very quickly, and then maybe there's some time and interest for questions. We are trying really to develop a method to infer these input-output linkages at the product level. At the moment, I think it is going quite well, although we still have to do some refinements. There are some problems also and caveats when using trade level, firm level trade data. But so far, I think it is performing relatively well, and we hope to develop this further, this approach, to get, I think, a bit more clear and clear-cut results. And then, of course, if it really makes sense and is reasonable what we obtain, we are also, of course, happy to share this mapping and the code to generate them so that it will be better or easier to also empirically evaluate the propagation of these trade shocks along the supply chain. And yes, for now, I think I would like to thank you, and I'm looking forward to some comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karsten, for this very informative seminar. I will stop the recording first.